15-minute or less lecture series, Anatomy and Physiology, Chapter 16, Respiratory System, Part 1. So, functions of the respiratory system include filtering, warming, and moistening the air that comes in as we breathe in, transporting the air to the alveoli deep in the lungs, thereby allowing for gas exchange, for oxygen to enter the bloodstream and carbon dioxide to come out of the bloodstream, sound production, especially in our larynx, olfaction or the sense of smell, and also regulation of the blood pH, which is very important. So respiration is the entire process of exchange of gases between the atmosphere all the way down to the cells of the body. This is a very big process that gets broken down into many smaller steps. So from that, below that is ventilation. Ventilation is actually the gas exchange into and out of the lungs. So breathing in and breathing out. That is ventilation. Now, external respiration is the gas exchange between the blood and the air in the lungs. From there, we have the gas, the oxygen in the bloodstream being transported to the tissues. Then internal respiration, the exchange of the gases between the blood and the tissues of the body. And then finally, cellular respiration, where the oxygen is get brought into the cell, goes to the mitochondria to produce ATP. Carbon dioxide, the waste, is produced and then sent out to eventually end up in the bloodstream and breathed out of our body. So, structurally dividing the respiratory system, the upper respiratory tract is the nose, nasal cavity, sinuses, and pharynx, basically places that you can relatively see easy or touch with a Q-tip, kind of. And then the lower respiratory tract, the larynx, trachea, bronchial tree, and lungs. The nose is supported by various bones and cartilage, provides an entrance for air to come into the body. The air is then filtered by coarse hairs found in the nostrils. The nasal cavity is separated by a nasal wall called the nasal septum. So you have two sides, right and left. Coming off the lateral walls of the nasal cavity are these nasal conchae, these little structures that push into that space. They break the cavity into passageways that are lined with mucous membrane, increasing the surface area that then gets to be exposed to the air being brought in. This allows the air to become warmed, to get water into it, to moisturize it, and to filter any particulates out of the air. The nasal cavity is lined with mucous membrane that is producing mucus. The mucus is there to catch any particulates in the air. Mucus is then sent by the action of cilia toward the pharynx and throat to be swallowed, and then the mucus and any particulates and pathogens in it can be destroyed by the gastric juices, the acids in the stomach. And this, of course, is one of our second lines of defenses against infection. And just to note, it's the goblet cells in the epithelial lining that produces the mucus. All right, we also have paranasal sinuses, spaces found inside of our maxillary bones, our frontal bone, our ethmoid bone, and our sphenoid bone. These open spaces are lined with mucous membrane. They are there to help reduce the overall weight of the skull. They serve also as a resonance chamber to affect the quality of sound. And because they're covered in mucous membrane, they produce mucus that then drips into the nasal cavity. We also have the oral cavity, not considered a part of the respiratory system, but let's be honest here, we know we can breathe in and out of our mouth. All right, the pharynx, or the back of the throat. The pharynx is a passageway running from the nasal cavity down to just above the larynx and esophagus. It is broken down into three main areas: the nasopharynx that comes after the nasal cavity, the oral pharynx, which comes after the oral cavity, and the laryngopharynx that is directly above the larynx and esophagus. The larynx, part of the lower respiratory tract. The larynx is an enlarged area that carries air and is able to connect to the trachea further down. In order to prevent food and liquids and stuff from entering the larynx, there's the epiglottis, which covers the top of the larynx and sends the food and fluids down into the esophagus. The larynx also houses the vocal cords, which produce sound, allow us to speak. The larynx is a framework of muscles and cartilage bound by elastic tissue. There is, of course, the hyoid bone, the elastic cartilage, epiglottic cartilage here and here that folds over the top of the larynx. The thyroid cartilage sticks out anteriorly, often called the Adam's apple. And the cricoid cartilage is the very inferior portion of the larynx. Thyroid and cricoid cartilages are made of hyaline. The epiglottis is elastic cartilage. It covers the top of the larynx to prevent fluid and liquids from getting into the larynx. There are the two pairs of folds. The superior fold is the false vocal cords. They're primarily for structural reasons and to allow us the ability to close the larynx. And also the below that and inferior to that, the true vocal cords, which are the ones that vibrate to produce sound. You can change tension on the true vocal cords through the contractions of muscles. Tightening the vocal cords will produce a higher pitch. Weakening relaxation of these muscles can cause a deeper pitch. And of course, if you want a louder sound to be produced, you just increase the force of air that is hitting the vocal cords. All right, then we have the trachea. The trachea is anterior or in front of the esophagus. So here's the esophagus, here's the trachea. It extends down to the thoracic cavity, then splits into the right and left main bronchi. The tracheal wall is supported by 20 or so incomplete cartilaginous rings. So these cartilaginous rings are sort of C-shaped, but very rigid to keep the trachea open. The inner lining of the trachea is of ciliated mucous membrane, which has goblet cells producing mucus that trap particulates. This should sound familiar, except in this case, the mucus is sent up to the pharynx to be swallowed. If someone has a persistent blockage in the trachea, they may get a tracheotomy. An incision is formed below the cricoid cartilage in order to avoid damaging the larynx and allowing the person to have an extra outlet for breathing. From here, the trachea splits into the bronchial tree, composed of the right and left main bronchi. Each of the bronchi go to a different lung, passing into the lung through the hilum. These bronchi are also to have mucous membrane linings with cilia in most of them that filters, warms air, catches particulates, etc. The main bronchi split into the lobar bronchi, go to each lobe of the lung, and the lobar bronchi branch into the segmental bronchi that go to each segment found within the lungs. The bronchial tree continues branching into smaller and smaller bronchi until finally they become the microscopic bronchioles. You finally reach the terminal bronchiole, which is not actually the last of the bronchioles. After the terminal bronchioles, you have the respiratory bronchioles, which then split into the alveolar ducts that go to the alveolar sacs, made up of teeny tiny little alveoli. Gas exchange can occur in the respiratory bronchioles, the alveolar ducts, and the alveoli, but most of it occurs in the alveoli. So, movement of air goes from trachea to the main bronchi, to the lobar bronchi, to the segmental bronchi, to many more smaller bronchi, to the bronchioles, which are microscopic, which finally become the terminal bronchioles, which then has the air enter the respiratory bronchioles, the alveolar ducts, to the alveolar sacs, to the individual alveoli. Gas exchange occurs through the alveoli primarily, through the very thin walls that are thin, simple squamous epithelial cells. Gas move between the alveoli and the pulmonary capillaries, which again are also super thin, simple squamous structures. Oxygen enters the bloodstream, carbon dioxide enters the air in the alveoli. And this again is external respiration. All right, the lungs. We have a right and left lung. The lungs are surrounded by their own pleural membrane. This is a serous membrane with the visceral layer lying on the lung and the parietal pleura on the outside. The function of the pleural membranes is to reduce friction as the lungs are constantly expanding and contracting and rubbing against the structure surrounding them. The lungs are soft, spongy, cone-shaped sort of structures separated by the mediastinum. Inferior to them is the diaphragm. They're actually attached to the diaphragm, and they're surrounded by the thoracic cage. The right lung has 3 lobes, superior, middle, and inferior. The left lung has 2 lobes, superior and inferior. Left lung also has this cardiac notch, which is basically making room for the heart, which is a little off-centered. Each lobe contains airway passages, alveoli, nerves, blood vessels, lymphatic vessels. Very, very complicated structures the lungs are. All right, ventilation, allowing air to come into the lungs and allowing air to go out of the lungs. Allowing air to come into the lungs is also known as inspiration or inhaling, and allowing the air to come out is expiration or exhaling. During inspiration, you need to have the atmospheric pressure be higher than the pressure in the lung space. So in order to decrease the pressure in the air pressure in the lungs, you have to increase the lung volume. So by breathing in, we have the diaphragm and external intercostals spread out, causing the lungs to increase in volume. This increase in volume causes the pressure to go down. Now the air pressure in the lungs is less than outside, so air rushes into the lungs. The important muscles, as I mentioned, are the diaphragm, which contracts and moves downward, pulling the lungs downward, increasing their volume in that direction, and the external intercostal muscles between the ribs that, as they contract, pull the thoracic cage outward, pull the lungs outward, increasing their volume, lowering the air pressure in the lungs. So again, the intra-alveolar volume needs to be increased to decrease its pressure so that the pressure in the atmosphere is greater, goes from high pressure to low pressure, rushes into the lungs. You can also take an extremely deep breath. Try to breathe in absolutely as much as you can. This will then involve additional muscles, pectoralis minor, sternocleidomastoid, scalene muscles. Expiration. Expiration occurs on its own. When you stop contracting those muscles and they relax, the lungs will recoil. They are elastic, and so they will return to their original size. This will decrease the volume, thereby increasing the air pressure in the lungs. The lungs' air pressure will then be greater than the atmospheric pressure, and so air will rush out of the lungs into the air. However, if you want to breathe out faster, called forced expiration, you can use various muscles to help that to happen. You can use your internal intercostal muscles to compress the rib cage faster. The muscles of your abdominal wall can be contracted to push on the abdomen and thereby pushing on the diaphragm. So the basic net note, though, is if you increase the volume of the lungs, this decreases pressure in the lungs. Air comes in. If you decrease the volume of the lungs, you increase the pressure in the lungs. Air goes out. All right, there are ways to measure the various capacities, the volumes that your lungs can hold, because this can vary from person to person, depending on all kinds of different factors. Often a machine called a spirometer is used to determine these various respiratory volumes. So there are four main respiratory volumes. There is the tidal volume. The tidal volume is the amount of air you breathe in and out normally when you're in a relaxed state, just breathing in and out. That's the tidal volume. Forced inspiration leads to the inspiratory reserve volume, this extra area in the lungs that can actually be filled with air. So if you try to inhale the maximum amount, you can greatly increase the amount of air in your lungs. Then the expiratory reserve volume is that extra air found in the lungs that you can force out when you do a forced expiration. So if you breathe out as absolutely hard as you can, you'll also release this extra air that is normally found in the lungs. And finally, there's a residual volume, amount of air that is always in the lungs, that is needed always to be there because it helps keep the lungs inflated and functional. And so that volume you never get rid of, hopefully. Finally, you can add these different volumes together to get what are called respiratory capacities. You can have your inspiratory capacity, all the air you can breathe in, the functional residual capacity, which is all the air that's in your lungs when you're breathing normally, vital capacity, which is pretty much all the air that you can breathe in and out if you try really, really hard. And then finally, the total lung capacity, which includes the residual volume that you never, ever want to expel.